Every rustle behind the door is the sound of an executioner's footsteps. Every shadow in the luxurious chambers is the silhouette of a man with a silk cord. This was the reality for Sultan Ibrahim for 25 years. It wasn't a life, but a gilded wait for death in a place ironically named the Kor, Kafes, the cage. Luxurious but sealed apartments, where the prince's only company was concubines and eunuchs, became his entire world. The Kafes system was a cruel invention of the Ottoman court, designed to prevent conspiracies and power struggles. Instead of killing his brothers, a new sultan would imprison them, condemning them to a slow withering in isolation. Born in 1615, Ibrahim was the son of Sultan Ahmed I and one of the most powerful women in the history of the Ottoman Empire, Kösem Sultan. However, his high birth became his curse. After his father's death, he became a hostage of the system, while his older brother, Sultan Murad IV, mercilessly eliminated relatives, seeing them as potential rivals. The constant fear of execution and years of solitude irrevocably damaged the boy's psyche. Contemporaries noted that even in his youth, he was fearful, emotionally unstable, and prone to hysterics. The only shield between Ibrahim and certain doom was his mother. It was the powerful Kösem Sultan who saved her son from execution when Murad I V, having dealt with his other brothers, ordered Ibrahim's death as well. But even a mother's protection could not heal the wounds of the soul. Deprived of normal human connections, he began to satisfy his hunger in the only way available. In the Kafes, Ibrahim developed a maniacal passion for the two things that could compensate for his lack of freedom: luxury and women. This broken, perpetually frightened man was living proof of the system's monstrosity. It is no wonder that a Venetian ambassador would later write in his reports, "Prince Ibrahim feared his own shadow and wept at the sound of footsteps in the corridor, thinking the executioners had come for him." 25 years in this golden hell forged not a future ruler, but a broken paranoid. The system created to protect the dynasty had spawned a monster who would soon shake the empire to its very foundations. No one could have predicted that this trembling, fearful captive would become the master of the world, and that his first step to power would begin with a refusal to leave his own prison. The door that had symbolized confinement for 25 years was finally supposed to open, but not for an executioner. In February 1640, Sultan Murad IV died without leaving any heirs. Suddenly, the trembling prisoner of the Kafes became the sole surviving male of the Ottoman dynasty, the legitimate ruler of one of the world's greatest empires. It seemed like liberation. For Ibrahim, it was a new spiral of terror. When the courtiers, led by the Grand Vizier, came to announce his accession to the throne, Ibrahim barricaded himself inside. He was convinced it was a trap, an elaborate and final jest by his cruel brother, a way to lure him out of the only safe place he had ever known, only to finally execute him. No amount of persuasion or oaths could move him. The prisoner who had become a sultan was refusing the throne. The dramatic scene at the doors of the Kafes reached its climax when the dignitaries were forced to take an extreme measure. They brought the lifeless body of Murad I to Ibrahim's chambers. Only after seeing his dead brother with his own eyes did Ibrahim believe that the nightmare was over, or rather, that a new one was just beginning. Stepping out of his cage, he did not become a ruler. The first days of his reign were paralyzed by fear and indecision. The Sultan, who had received absolute power, was so traumatized that he could not make the simplest decisions. In effect, the empire was run by those who had brought him into the light: his mother, the formidable Kösem Sultan, and the Grand Vizier. The court was in shock. Courtiers, accustomed to the fearsome Murad, now saw a broken man on the throne, whose mental state raised serious concerns. Many secretly doubted he was capable of ruling at all. Their fears were confirmed during the coronation. Legend has it that when the Sultan's turban was placed on Ibrahim's head, he burst into tears and for several hours repeated the same phrase, "I don't want to be the Sultan, take me back to my room." Meanwhile, dark rumors began to spread in the palace corridors. Was Murad V's death truly natural? Had he not been poisoned by those who wanted a manageable, broken puppet on the throne instead of a strong ruler? The man who had been freed by force became the perfect instrument in others' hands, but no one yet knew what this instrument would turn into once it tasted limitless power. The man who feared the throne quickly discovered its greatest advantage: absolute license. While his mother Kösem Sultan and her loyal viziers handled the tedious affairs of state, Ibrahim dove headfirst into the only sphere that interested him. The harem became his personal paradise and a laboratory for his twisted fantasies, a way to compensate for a quarter-century of sensory deprivation, and this hunger was insatiable. Soon, the Sultan developed an obsession that baffled even the worldly Ottoman court. He became fixated on heavy-set women. On his orders, agents were dispatched throughout the empire with a single mission: to find and deliver the most voluptuous beauties to the palace. The pinnacle of this mania was his chief favorite, a woman whose name spoke for itself, Seker Para, meaning sugar cube. Weighing over 100 kilograms, she became the living embodiment of the ruler's ideal. But mere possession was not enough. Ibrahim violated even the unwritten laws of the harem that had been established over centuries. He organized orgies with multiple concubines at once, and one of his favorite pastimes was forcing the girls to dance naked before his guests. This was not just indulging his desires, but a defiant break with the past, with all rules and restrictions. This new life demanded a fitting backdrop. The treasury, painstakingly filled with taxes and spoils of war, began to drain away like sand through fingers. The Sultan spent colossal sums on jewels for his favorites, the rarest fabrics and exotic perfumes. In a single year, he spent more than some of his predecessors had in a decade. The height of this mad extravagance was his order to line the harem walls with precious sable furs and to cover the floors with carpets woven in Persia from pure gold thread. Observing this, a foreign ambassador caustically remarked in a dispatch, "The Sultan behaves like a man who has seen a woman for the first time and thinks the world will end tomorrow." He was right. For Ibrahim, the world did end every day, only to be reborn in the arms of his harem. But no one guessed that behind this facade of unbridled debauchery, the seeds of a much darker madness were already beginning to sprout. The sweet smoke of incense in the harem began to mix with the scent of fear. The period of unrestrained hedonism was over, giving way to something far darker. The shadows that had haunted Ibrahim in the Kafes now came to life in his own palace. The paranoia that had slumbered beneath layers of depravity awoke and began to devour his mind. He saw enemies everywhere. In the whispers of his viziers he heard conspiracy. In the silence of the janissaries, a threat. In the glances of his concubines, betrayal. Suspicions instantly became sentences. Several high-ranking officials were executed on the Sultan's word alone, based on delusional accusations. No one was safe. His amusements became as ugly as his fears. In fits of uncontrollable rage, he would hurl precious goblets at servants, beat anyone for the slightest offense, and found a perverse pleasure in personally watching prisoners being tortured. The palace lived to the rhythm of his hysterics. One day he could scream for hours, smashing priceless furniture and tearing his silk robes, and the next, display a sadistic cruelty that became his trademark. He ordered the newborn daughters of his concubines to be drowned, coldly explaining that women bring only misfortune. His mind became a battlefield of extremes. Periods of wild debauchery were replaced by fits of ostentatious religious fanaticism, when he would force the entire court, from the vizier to the kitchen boy, to perform prayer 10 times a day. This mental agony produced absurd decrees. On one occasion, Ibrahim ordered all the songbirds in the palace to be executed, declaring that their singing was a, quote, conspiracy against his sleep. Even his mother, the all-powerful Kösem Sultan, could only occasionally calm the storm in her son's soul. A court physician, risking his head, made a terrifying entry in his diary. The Sultan suffers from a sickness of the mind that causes him to see enemies where there are none, and to kill those who love him. The empire watched in horror as its sovereign turned into a monster. The question was no longer whether the Sultan was mad, but how much longer the world could withstand his madness. It all started with a piece of paper, a love note of unknown origin found in the Harem quarters. For a mind poisoned by paranoia, this was enough. Ibrahim did not bother to find the guilty party. In his inflamed consciousness, this was not the transgression of a single concubine, but a total conspiracy, a betrayal by all the women upon whom he had bestowed his favor and sable furs. And the punishment had to be total. In 1647, he gave an order that still chills the blood of historians. The order to drown his entire harem, all of them, 280 girls, whose only crime was to be his property. Imagine that night, a quiet, secret operation conducted in the strictest confidence. The girls were bound, stuffed into sacks, with stones thrown in for good measure. Then, boats silently pushed off from the shore, and, one by one, dropped their living, struggling cargo into the cold, dark waters of the Bosphorus. What sounds broke the silence of that night? Only the dull splashes in the water and, perhaps, the cries of gulls. Even the battle-hardened janissaries, accustomed to cruelty and executions, were shocked. This was not a crackdown on enemies, not the suppression of a rebellion. This was a cold-blooded, senseless mass murder. Rumors of the Sultan's madness spread throughout Istanbul, now impossible to ignore. They say that only one survived that hell, a concubine named Turhan, who, according to rumor, managed to hide in the eunuch's quarters. Fate ironically decreed that she would later give birth to a son, Mehmed, the future sultan, extending the dynasty that her master had so diligently tried to drown. But there is one detail, the most monstrous in this whole story. Ibrahim did not just give the order, he personally attended the execution. Sitting on the shore, he laughed as he watched the sacks disappear one by one beneath the water. An Italian merchant would later write in his diary, "For 3 days the Bosphorus was red with blood, and the gulls would not go near the water, they sensed the death." The Sultan had cleansed his palace of betrayal. Now it could be filled anew. Silence. After the screams and splashes in the Bosphorus, a dead silence fell over the harem. But for Ibrahim, the emptiness was more unbearable than fear. Within a few months, the imperial machine, geared to satisfy the Sultan's whims, had refilled the deserted chambers. More than 200 new women from every corner of the empire were brought to the palace. This was no longer a collection for pleasure, but an inventory of property. And the rules for this new property became draconian. The number of eunuch overseers was doubled, Any conversation between concubines was strictly forbidden. Every breath could now be the last. Ibrahim's madness no longer required a valid reason for cruelty. A pretext was enough. A wrong glance, a laugh that was too loud, a voice that was too soft, any of these offenses could end in immediate execution. The harem transformed from a place of pleasure into a conveyor belt of death. The madness no longer contented itself with the walls of the harem. It spilled out into the halls of the divan, where the fates of millions were decided. The Sultan saw conspiracies in every report. He executed several grand viziers in a row, accusing them of treason without a shred of evidence. The state apparatus was paralyzed with terror. No one wanted to make a decision, knowing that it could cost them their head the next day. The empire began to crack at the seams. Insane spending on the new harem, set against a backdrop of military failures and administrative chaos, led to financial collapse. The treasury was empty. Patience ran out even among those who, by duty, were supposed to be the pillars of the throne. The Islamic clergy, witnessing this Sabbath, began to openly condemn the Sultan, calling him an, quote, enemy of the faith. The apotheosis of his mental disintegration was one of Ibrahim's last decrees. He ordered all the mirrors in the palace to be shattered. Why? The Sultan declared that reflections are stealing his soul. The man on the throne could no longer bear the sight of himself. The cup of patience had overflowed. The Grand Mufti, the highest religious authority, issued his verdict in the form of a fatwa that became a death sentence for Ibrahim's rule. The Sultan no longer serves Allah. He serves Shaitan and is leading the empire to its doom. The empire held its breath, awaiting the denouement, and it came. In 1648, the cup of patience overflowed. The economy was in ruins. The army was demoralized, and the tyranny of a sultan who had completely lost touch with reality threatened the very existence of the state. The sword of the empire, the janissaries, its administrative backbone, the nobility, and its spiritual core, the clergy, united against one man. But the most devastating blow was dealt by the one who had been his shield his entire life. His mother, Kösem Sultan, the woman who had saved him from the executioner's cord in his youth, now passed sentence on him herself. She realized that her son's madness had become a threat to the entire dynasty. Her choice was horrific, but from her perspective, the only correct one. Sacrifice her son to save the empire. She would later say words that echo the full tragedy of her decision. I gave birth to a monster who would have devoured the entire empire. It is better to kill my son than to let him kill the people. The rebellion received a solid legal and religious foundation. The Grand Mufti issued a fatwa, officially declaring Ibrahim unfit to rule by reason of insanity. It was an unprecedented step in Ottoman history. The spiritual leader of the nation had declared its ruler mad. The Janissaries, who had traditionally been the support of the throne, openly opposed their sultan, demanding his immediate abdication. When the rebels entered the palace, they were prepared for a fight, but there was no battle, no resistance. Ibrahim showed no will to hold on to power. By this point, he had sunk so deep into the abyss of his madness that he didn't even understand what was happening. He didn't fight for his throne, nor did he call for his guards. He was merely a passive spectator at his own downfall. The circle was complete. The deposed sultan was once again imprisoned in the Kafes, the very place where his journey had begun. The luxurious cage that had raised him became his final abode, and outside the palace walls, Istanbul rejoiced. The news of the tyrant's overthrow was met with public celebration. People took to the streets, feasting and celebrating their deliverance. For the entire empire, it was a sigh of relief. The nightmare was over. All that remained was to decide what to do with its chief architect. 10 days. Only 10 days separated his deposition from his death. In his old new prison, he did not quiet down. On the contrary, deprived of his power and his harem, Ibrahim descended completely into the abyss of madness. He continued to rave about conspiracies, screamed at invisible concubines, and demanded that new wives be brought to him immediately. His cries echoed through the palace corridors, serving as a grim reminder of the recent past. The new government, headed by the mother of the 6-year-old Sultan Mehmed IV, understood that a living Ibrahim, even an insane one, was a ticking time bomb. He could become a banner for any rebellion. The decision was made quickly and without hesitation. It was officially announced that he had died of illness, but the entire empire knew the truth. On August 17, 1648, Ibrahim was strangled. The executioners came for him in the same cage where he had once awaited them throughout his youth. The ceremony befitted the end of his reign, swift and shameful. The empire wanted not just to bury his body, but to erase the very memory of him. Many documents and archives related to his 8-year reign were destroyed. The authorities tried to excise this disgraceful chapter from their history. His body was buried at night, in an unmarked grave, so that his final resting place would not become a site of pilgrimage for the mad and the discontented. But the fear he had sown lived on for a long time. His own son, Mehmed IV, ruled for 39 years, but he spent his entire life in mortal terror of repeating his father's fate, a fear that cast a shadow over his entire reign. The general atmosphere was best captured by the historian Evliya Çelebi, who wrote in his chronicle, "Ibrahim's death was a relief for the entire empire. Even his own mother breathed a sigh of relief." The tyrant was dead, but the question of who he truly was, a monster or a victim, remained open. So who was Ibrahim I? A monster who reveled in blood, or a broken victim of a monstrous system? To this day, history does not provide a clear answer. Some researchers see him as nothing more than a mad tyrant. Others, and they are the majority, believe that the golden cage is what made him a monster. Modern historians are almost unanimous. The trauma of his 25-year confinement in the Kafes was the root cause of his disintegration. From a psychiatric perspective, his behavior fits the profile of severe paranoid schizophrenia, aggravated by complete isolation. But a diagnosis does not negate his actions. Ibrahim remains a unique case in world history. No other monarch has ever committed an act comparable to the mass murder of his own harem. His bloody reign, paradoxically, led to positive changes. It forced the empire to reform the system of succession and to consider limiting the absolute power of the sultan. The story of the Mad Sultan has passed into Turkish folklore, becoming a cautionary tale and an eternal warning. The final assessment of his life is not an excuse, but a statement of fact. As one modern Ottoman historian put it, quote, Ibrahim I showed that absolute power in the hands of a mentally ill person can lead to the catastrophe of an entire empire.